Good morning, guys, from scenic Utah. I am just now wrapping up a magical getaway, the Vanishing Ink Western Retreat. And while I was here, I had the amazing fortune of talking with the one and only Mike Caveney, the owner of MC Magic Words, publishing books we all know and love, like Guy Hollingworth's Drawing Room Deceptions. Among all of the action-packed things going on this weekend, I managed to score some time with him to talk about how he got into magic book publishing, and what we can learn from a titan like the Assassin of Gloom. There was some background noise during the interview, but I know you'll enjoy the information so much, I wanted you to have it, even with all of its flaws. So please enjoy this interview with Mike Caveney. I appreciate you being here, Mike.
Good to see you, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about magic books.
Yep.
Obviously, you've written so many with your company over many decades, so you have a lot of experience with this, and really wanted to start off by asking you, how did you get started writing books?
That's a good question, because I was no A student, believe me, in English class in high school. In fact, when I got to college, I said, yeah, I'll take English, and they said, well, what was your grade in high school? I go, I don't know, C or something. And they go, well, you can't take this class. You have to take, now I'm sure they didn't call it this, but it was known as dumbbell English. And I go, I got to take dumbbell English? And I did, and fortunately I had a great teacher who taught me a lot. I would say, I know this to be a fact, I'm not a great writer by any stretch, but I think that I'm a good storyteller. And I would rather be a good storyteller than a great writer, because you can go back and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, which I do. But if you can end up with a really well-told story, people are going to like it. So that's what I try to do, tell good stories. Tell stories in my act and tell stories with my books.
What was the first book that you wrote? I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Well, you wouldn't. You probably weren't born. The first book I ever published, I was in Paris, and I met Bernard Billis, a great French close-up magician, and he said, hey, I have this manuscript, but I don't know when to publish it. And I, knowing absolutely nothing, I said, well, I could publish it. And he gave it to me, and I took it home and published it. French Pasteboards. A really good book. So that kind of got us started, Tina and I. And then, I'm not sure which was next. They probably came close. I was friends with Eric Lewis, the great Eric Lewis, father of Martin Lewis. And Eric, who lived near me, said, I'm writing a set of 3 books. And I finished the first one, and I'm into the second one. But they're going to be big, hardbound, expensive books, and I have no one to publish them.
Were those the 3 miracle books?
They were. And I thought, because he showed them, he wrote it. Eric's a great writer. And I know that because this was long before computers, and Eric would literally take a piece of typing paper and roll it into his typewriter and bang out a page, pull the page out, put it face down in a stack, and he never looked at it again, and I guarantee that page appears in those books somewhere.
Wow.
Type out the page, done. No rewrite, no edit, no nothing. So, and he was also a great artist, and so he did all of his own illustrations, and he was a great creator, and he created all of this great magic. And so I thought, well, if I was going to publish books, what better thing to start with than Eric Lewis's books? So I said, hey, we'll publish it. And he was thrilled. And it was a big, back in these days, this was the early 80s now, we actually bought, Tina and I, there's no desktop publishing. We bought a CompuGraphic computer typesetter. It weighed 850 pounds. It was literally the size of this giant table here. And to get it into our house, we had to have a guy come out and undo all the wires and take it into 2 sections. We had to take the door off the hinges to move these 2 enormous sections into this room. He put it back together, and we were typesetting. Nobody was typesetting at home.
I was about to say, it's amazing to me that you were doing this in your house.
It's crazy. These machines were very expensive. We bought it used. And Tina became a typesetter. Now, before this, they had set type with a hot lead linotyper for 150 years. And then for maybe 10 years, they used this photo typesetting, computer typesetting, which was a crazy system, but you could do it at home without a big pot of bubbling hot lead.
So it was a plus.
Yeah, and then came the Apple Macintosh computer, and it changed the whole world. And I remember we sold this enormous machine the size of a Volkswagen to a little newspaper in town, and we carried it literally upstairs under our arm, the replacement, the very first Macintosh.
Wow.
So that was a real game changer. So we published Eric's trilogy, and then I thought, well, I want to write a book, see if I can write a book with all my dumbbell English class behind me. So I wrote Magic Comedy, which was kind of the stuff that I had done in the past, and not really the stuff that I was doing at that time. So I wrote it. Eric Lewis illustrated it, and it had some good routines actually that I did perform in my act at that time, and the routines as they existed at that time. But I'm a big believer in a trick is never finished. You never stop thinking about a routine. So what's it been? 40 plus years later, when I published Mike Caveney Wonders, right? Some of the routines that were in Magic Comedy are in Mike Caveney Wonders. The one I think of is the Bill and Cigar trick. And I think if you read the Magic Comedy and said, oh, that's how he does the Bill and Cigar, and then saw me perform it today, you'd be completely fooled, because that's how much that method changed over the decades.
Wow.
So I did Magic Comedy. That was my first book. Then I got interested in magic history, and I started going to magic collectors' weekends back in Chicago, and started collecting old books and started collecting posters and things like that. And I knew the son of the great Leon. And amazingly, at a flea market, I found a little stack of great Leon material from some lady who I'm sure had no idea who he was. So I bought this stuff and I got interested. And I said, wow, this is the father of Leon, the old man at the time that I knew. So I went to Leon and I said, hey, I want to write a book about your father. And he was thrilled. And he sat with me for hours and hours, telling me stories, because he used to travel in his dad's act back in vaudeville in the teens. And so I did my research through my library, through all the old magazines. There's no internet, of course, so it was whatever I could dig out. And with all the information Leon got me, and with the photographs that I got from a flea market, and my good friend Les Arnold was the great Leon's grandson. Les had some old scrapbook things like that. So I wrote this book on the great Leon, and it was kind of a test to see, I wonder if I can write a book like that, not a book of tricks, but a book about somebody. And yeah, I did. It was fine. It's a pretty simple book, and I didn't have tons of material, but I had enough to make a good story. And so I told the story of Leon.
And it told you could do it, right?
That was the most important thing. Hey, I can do this. And then some years after that, I got the opportunity to buy Charles Carter's entire show and everything that came with that. And what came with it, mainly for me, was about 25 banker boxes full of scrapbooks and photographs and programs and newspaper clippings and letters and receipts. And this guy never threw anything away in his whole life.
Which is beautiful for a historian.
Well, it was unprecedented to me. And I got all this stuff into my basement, and I spent weeks and weeks and weeks going through this stuff. And I always told people it was like panning for gold, because you go through hotel receipts. Every week there's another, how many hundreds of hotel receipts. And then you find a letter from Houdini, or a letter from Thurston, or 130 letters from the Otis Lithograph Company.
Right, we talked.
Yeah, and you go, this is unbelievable. And I realized then I could write the most comprehensive detailed biography about a magician ever written, because I've got his whole life here.
Right.
And the first thing that I thought of was, I hope this guy led an interesting life, because I could end up with a 700-page book that's so boring because he just went to the same towns and did the same boring show. Fortunately for me, he led an unbelievable life. He made 7 trips around the world, and I mean, everything that could possibly happen to him happened to him.
For sure.
And it's kind of, even after all these decades later, people ask me, what's your favorite? And I go, I think it's Carter the Great, because it's such an astonishing story.
Well, you preempted my question, because I was going to say, you well, it's good that you did, but I was going to say you've written all these interesting books and was curious about what your favorite was, so it is the Carter book.
This episode of Erudite Magic is being sponsored by Don's Magic and Books, who wants to make sure that as you follow Mike's advice about buying more books and having a great library that you can learn from, you're able to save buying those books. So this week, if you apply the code FALL at checkout, you'll save 10% off the already remarkably low prices that he has on his website. So be sure to visit him by clicking the link down in the description below and start saving this week as you build out your library.
I think so, although I would have to mention my latest one, the Sawing in Half story.
Yes.
And the story on that was the Sawing in Half illusion, as we know it today, started in 1921 with P.T. Selbit and Horace Golden. And in 1971, 50 years later, I was in college, and I had a class where the professor said, all you do in this class is write a term paper. I honestly can't remember what the class was, but I do remember that I went to this guy and I said, okay, I would like to write a paper on the history of sawing a lady in half. And I'm sure he thought, I don't even know what that means, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he said, all right, have at it. I was interested in this trick because I'd seen it when I was a kid. So it's 50 years into this trick, and there were people around, amazingly, that saw P.T. Selbit perform that trick and saw Horace Golden perform that trick. And I interviewed all of them. So I had all this great first-hand information, and I started collecting material and going through newspapers and magazines and collecting enough material to write a term paper, which I did. The professor, of course, knew none of this, had never heard of any of these people. So he went, well, this is amazing, nice going. But that didn't. I never stopped. I never stopped collecting information or ephemera dealing with the history of sawing a lady in half. For 50 years, I did that. Now, that started in 1971. In 2021, it's been 50 years. I've got so much material on this trick, it's ridiculous. And the pandemic hits. And now I'm not doing magic shows, I'm not leaving my house. What do? 1921, 2021. It is the 100th anniversary of Sawing a Lady in Half,
Which is brilliant.
well, so finally, now I can do something with all this material. And it's good that I waited, because now, with the internet and with all these online newspapers, searchable all over the world, it's just unbelievable. So I tell people this was the best pandemic ever. I spent the whole time immersed in the Sawing a Lady in Half. And the stories that I discovered blew my mind. Things that I thought I knew. I know how this got to here, and I was completely wrong. So it was a great exploration, and I loved writing this book. And I'm thrilled with this book because people look at this book and say, how on earth did you get all this material? It's beautiful. And my answer is, when you collect this stuff for 50 years, if you get 2 nice things in a year, after 50 years, you've got 100 fantastic images to put in this book. So that's how I did it.
Wow. And we're eternally grateful to the professor in that class that you wrote that
That's right.
paper.
You know
and
what?
Continued that journey.
I can't even remember his name, but you're right, thanks to him.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So what's next for you? So you talked about it a little bit. What's up to now? You've written this amazing book and some of these others. What's in the future for Mike Caveney?
So a few years ago, I published Mike Caveney Wonders. So it's interesting. So you become a magician, and you're very protective of all your routines. I don't want you doing this trick. Hey, that's my routine. What do you think you're doing? I learned this from Harry Anderson. And the way Harry described it was, he said, when you're a young magician, all the magic in the world is out in this big river. And we all go down to the river's edge and we go, you know what, this is a good idea. I love this idea. Oh, that's a great line. Can I use that line? And we pull things out of this river and we create our careers out of it. And at some point, and you'll have to figure out what this point is for yourself, it's time to take everything down to the river and throw it back in.
That's a great analogy.
It is. And I remember when Harry explained that to me, I go, what? I'm not doing that. Well, 20 years later, you go, you know what? Of course, Harry was right. And I thought, I've spent my whole life working on these routines. And if I put them all in a book, it doesn't mean I can't do them anymore. I can still do them. But if someone else finds something to use, what's the harm in that? So that's my big Mike Caveney Wonders book.
And when can we expect that? Is that
That's out of print.
Oh yeah, right. I have the Wonder Book. Okay.
That's the one. Yeah, you got it. It came. I don't know. It came out in 2013 or 14, something like that. Big expensive book because it was a 2-volume thing, and they're all gone.
Okay.
But the second volume was called The Conference Illusions, the Los Angeles Conference on Magic History. Jim Steinmeier, John Gunn, and I put this on for years, and we would take old time illusions that haven't been seen in 100 years, and we'd each pick our own thing, and we'd either get an old original one or build one from scratch, spend half the year working on figuring out the routine, writing pattern, recording music, getting costumes, conning your friends into assisting you with it so you could do it once, which is insane, right? But that's what the conference was. And so when I published these books, I had done a number of things for the conference, and so the Conference Illusions contains all those illusions that I worked on. Since that book was published, I did 3 more illusions at the Los Angeles conference. I have Carter the Great's original spirit cabinet. Wow. And I did that. And I had the Birth of a Pearl. That's the big oyster shell that is empty and a girl appears in. It was invented by Chung-Ling Soo, and the one that I got was built by Chung-Ling Soo's assistant. So we worked out a whole routine with that, and then the other one was, and this is actually the trick that got me started on my sawing in half journey. My good friend John Daniel, who lived very near to me in Pasadena, is the guy who sort of invented or repopularized the thin model sawing, the sawing with the very thin box that the girl just fit in. And I saw that when I was 13 years old, and that's what, man, I love this trick. And John passed away, but he always talked about maybe using his daughter Michelle in that trick once. His wife Kathy did it thousands of times, but he always thought it would be really nice to have Michelle do it. He never did. And his wife Kathy, after John passed away, called me and said, how would you like to do John's original thin sawing with Michelle at the Magic History Conference? Wow. A dream come true.
Right.
So we did, and it was a great night. And so now I've got the Spirit Cabinet and the Birth of a Pearl and this thin model sawing. Of course, I just published 440 pages on the sawing in half.
Right.
What possibly could there be left that you didn't put? And I can't believe it myself. I have so much new information on the thin model sawing. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
So I'm just finishing up that chapter now, and I have tons of photographs. So I'm really excited about that. the guy who actually invented the thin sewing, not in 1957 when John Daniel built his, but 20 years earlier in South America was a guy from Istanbul named Zadi Sungar that most people have never heard of. Well, I knew Zadi Sungar. In fact, when I was working on my term paper, I sent a letter to Istanbul to Zadi Sungar, who was still around. I got a big letter back from him.
Wow.
And he said, here's the whole story, which was fantastic. So I used that information in my book about the song. That book made its way, somebody got one, in Istanbul and showed it to Zadi Sungar's daughter. I get an email from Zadi Sungar's daughter, and she's thrilled to death that finally someone has given credit to her father. So she's now my new best friend, and
Wow.
she has sent me all kinds of photographs and information about him, about his show, about that trick. So I have a huge, brand new section on the thin sewing in this book.
Wow. Well, we're excited to see that.
Yeah, and the Spirit Cabinet was thrilling, and the Birth of a Pearl was a huge adventure, and all three of those illusions already are on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. So you can go see them and say, I'd love to know more about these.
And your channel name is just Mike Caveney?
Just Mike Caveney.
Okay. Last question for you is, do you have any advice for our viewers on learning from books, I'll say, or anything related to books, because that's what most of these viewers are?
You have to understand, I'm a dinosaur. I learned everything from books and from mentors, from old guys that saw I was serious and they were willing to help me. So, and of course now it's a video world, downloads and everything like that. And I think they're great. Here's what I think they're great for. I think a video is a great way to learn a move. So you can see exactly where to put each finger and to see what it looks like when an expert does it and say, okay, I know this is possible.
Right.
So let me review this a few times and you get that. But after that, I say no. I think now, when you want to learn a new trick or a new routine, you should go to a book where you can't hear every word and you can't see every little. You got to think for yourself.
Right.
And you have to, at some point, say, okay, I love this idea, but what am I going to do with it? How am I going to make this a Mike Caveney trick as opposed to this guy who wrote this book? So I love the fact that you have to fill in the blanks between the sentences in a book. And the other thing is, there are so many magic books published over the past 500 years. And not to mention magazines. And I mean, guys come to my house and they see my library, which is a good-sized room full of books and magazines. And they go, I don't get this. All this musty old paper. I got my whole library right here on my telephone. And I think, okay, I wish you knew what you were missing out on, because there's so much stuff that hasn't been digitized or that isn't on your telephone. Old magazines and things like that. So yeah, I love having new books as well as old books, classic books, and I love digging through magazines.
Awesome. Great advice. Thank you for your time, Mike.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Absolutely.
As always, my friends, I appreciate you watching. And until next time, keep reading.